I do believe that society, the global society, is transforming. It's changing the way, or we are changing the way that we think about our relationship with the rest of the planet. And not everybody's in the same place. You can look at it, every country's a different place, but even globally. And I think it probably looks sort of like a normal distribution, where you have a front end out here, which is really at the cutting edge, and you have most people down here at the top of the hump. And 20 years ago, the cutting edge was on climate change. 10 years ago, the cutting edge was on planetary boundaries. Now, the cutting edge is on transformational change and focusing on these interactions. Meanwhile, the top of the curve, where you have most people, is moving as well. And the top has now gotten to climate change, which is why climate change is as it is. And even the tail end is moving. There's not very many people anymore that say the climate isn't changing. They might question whether or not it's changing because of human activities. But this whole curve is moving. Now, it'll be a while before we get the top of the curve out where the cutting edge is. But notice something like the new IPCC report that came 2 weeks ago on land and the land interactions with. Suddenly, we're not talking simply about changing the energy system. We're talking also about changing our food system. And I think most people, when you go down the road, know we need to change our energy system. I think there are very few people, especially in a country like Denmark, that until recently at least have realized that, this is much more than energy. And this is also about food. And it says clearly in that IPCC report that how the world develops in terms of equality between people and resource allocation will play a very, very big role in how successful we are in achieving this. So you're beginning to mainstream what was a cutting edge discussion. So I think things are moving. And I think the more you get it fed to you from different angles and with different voices, including Greta Thunberg's, I think the more people realize that this is all encompassing. And certainly in Denmark, if we are going to reach the 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 that our politicians have said, our current government has said that we're going for in 2030, then people are going to realize that this is much more than just energy efficiency that we're talking about here. I think you make a lot of impact if people can associate with you. And so I do always try and be very much in contact with my audience. In fact, I've got a terrible problem now because of my age. I often can't see my notes without glasses, but the minute you put on reading glasses, then you end up with a barrier between you and your audience. And so I've gotten to the point where I make my notes in font 16, and I can still see them, but there's lots of pages of notes. So I think that's one of the critical things in terms of making impact. But you also have to be respected as being one of my tribe, as it were. And I'm also very humbled by the fact that I realize that many people don't consider professors their tribe. And it's interesting to see a 16-year-old schoolgirl from Sweden suddenly having this huge following. And it's not like she's saying anything new. She's saying exactly what I and my colleagues have been saying for decades now. And yet somehow she's having much more impact than we've been able to do. So knowing, having knowledge and being able to spit that knowledge out doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have impact. And I don't think we understand totally how you make impact, or even if you can sit back and decide, I'm going to make impact now. I think there are lots of stars that have to be aligned to really make impact. Sustainability is not a state. It's not something you come to. It's a process. It's a process of learning to live within the geophysical limits of the Earth. The Earth doesn't have an umbilical cord. We're not going to get more resources when we've used them all. And we get rich using the Earth's resources. So sustainable development is about learning to use those resources as effectively as possible, using them like we would use our money. Our natural resources, or the Earth's natural resources, they aren't ours, we just acquire them. But the Earth's natural resources are our real currency. And our ancestors understood this. They bought and sold from each other by bringing precious stones, food, fire, whatever. And we got much smarter. We use money, but money's still a proxy for those natural resources. For not very long ago, we had a gold standard behind our money. And none of us would use more money than absolutely necessary to buy a good or a service, but we all use more resources than are necessary to maintain our lifestyle. And just like our money, we've got money in the bank, and we can use our money in many, 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 many different ways, but we can't use more than we have, or we can convince the bank that we'd be able to pay back if we borrow. And it's the same way with our resources, or the Earth's resources. We can't use more than there are. And that's why we run into every year, now it's Earth Overshoot Day. Different countries arrive at Earth Overshoot Day at different times. And then they look at each other, at least in Denmark, people look at each other and say, oh, but nothing bad happened, it must be okay. Well, the reason nothing bad happened is there's still so many people who live in countries that don't hit Earth Overshoot. And that means we're using other people's resources to be able to, or access to resources, in order to be able to maintain our lifestyles. And if as far as I know, there's no one says that everyone on this planet doesn't have right to development. And when we use more than our share of resources, we're taking somebody else's right to development from them. I'm sure that when our ancestors stopped wandering around to find their food and started living in one place, initially they let their waste products, be they bodily or otherwise, fall wherever they were produced. And then they realized, hey, this isn't going to work. I mean, our water's getting polluted, we're getting sick from it, we're running out of game, we're running out of things we can burn. We need to make some kind of rules so that we live within our local resources. And then when we got to be more, we looked around and said, hey, it's not good enough to do it locally, because if we want clean air and water here in Denmark, we can't let the Swedes and the Poles and the Germans throw all their rubbish into the air or the water. And now we're getting to the point where the same is happening at the global level. We are so many people that we're recognizing that we need to manage the way we live, to live within the global resources. Now, the reason it works at the moment is because some people don't have access to those resources and others do. And I think when you talk about an Earth Overshoot Day, it's to try and make the point that if everybody lived like we do in Denmark, we would need over 4 Earths to be able to supply the resources needed for that kind of a lifestyle. So that means probably it means 2 things. It means that we have to change the way we use our resources, so we use them much more efficiently, and that I think we need to do first, so we make sure we're not using any more resource than absolutely necessary in order to be able to maintain our lifestyle. When it turns out, if it turns out that that's not enough, we might have to change our lifestyle. But I don't think that's where we start the discussion, because I don't think you have impact that way if you go to people immediately and say, you have to change your life. I think it's much better to start with, you need to change the way you're doing things in order to be able to maintain the life that you have. And only later, if and when they realize that changing isn't enough, they might have to change changing how we use resources. We might just have to use fewer or let others use some of the ones that we are. I think it'll be easier to take the discussion in stages.